Okay, let's see.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we have our next speaker, John Hull, and he is another big name in derivatives. We really have the who's who of finance today. So John is the Maple Finance Professor of Derivatives and Risk Management and Academic Director of the Financial Innovation Hub at Rotman, University of Toronto. He has been awarded the University Professor, an honor granted to only about 2% of the faculty at University of Toronto. His research has an applied focus and has been concerned with the impact of stochastic volatility on the pricing and hedging of options, the valuation of interest rate derivatives and credit derivatives, numerical procedures, the calculation of value at risk and expected shortfall, and the evaluation of model risk and the regulation of financial institutions. Recently, in his research and teaching, he has focused on machine learning and its applications to finance. He's best known for his books. Who does not know Hull's books? So the latest ones are Machine Learning in Business, an Introduction to the World of Data Science, now in its 3rd edition, Risk Management in Financial Institutions, now in its 6th edition, Options, Futures, and Other Derivatives, now in its 11th edition. Almost everybody I know in derivatives has read that book. And Fundamentals of Futures and Options Markets, now in its 9th edition. His books have been translated into many languages all around the world and widely used in trading rooms throughout the financial markets and in the classroom. So John, the floor is yours. John is going to talk on hedging barrier options using reinforcement learning. I think John was having some difficulty with the screen share, so I'm gonna share the screen with his presentation. And I think, let me just go to,
yeah, that looks good.
Yeah, no, that is good. Let me just go to the slide.
Make sure to a slideshow.
Right from the start, we've got it. So, okay, so, oops.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Sanjay. It is a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for that introduction. So, okay, I'm not quite ready to go that far ahead.
1 second. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Okay, so it is a real pleasure to be here. Yeah, as Sanjay says, I've sort of moved in terms of my research interests from derivatives to machine learning. I guess that happened maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I recognized that machine learning was becoming more and more important to our students. It was difficult to read a newspaper without some article about machine learning and AI in it somewhere. And so, I started to get interested, and I did see quite a few applications of machine learning in derivatives, and this is one of them that I'm going to be talking about today. It's the title of the paper is Hedging Barrier Options Using Reinforcement Learning. Now, reinforcement learning is a tool for taking not a single decision, but a series of decisions. It's a tool for coming up with a strategy for saying, I'm taking a certain decision today, and I'm going to be revising that decision tomorrow and revising it the next day, and so on and so on. And, it just seems ideal for hedging derivatives. So that's what this is about. I'm not going to be spending all my time talking about using it for barrier options. I'm going to be giving you a sense as to how the whole idea works. So this is actually the 3rd paper we've written in this area. The first paper was the deep hedging of derivatives using reinforcement learning, which, I guess we wrote, this knows probably 4 or 5 years ago. And that paper really just takes a plain vanilla option and compares what happens if you delta hedge it versus if you use reinforcement learning to hedge it. And the conclusions from that paper were reinforcement learning can do just as well as delta hedging, but actually it saves you on transaction costs. And I'll have more to say about that later. Then the next paper we wrote was gamma and vega hedging using deep distributional reinforcement learning, where we went away from delta hedging and said, well, maybe most of the benefits from reinforcement learning actually come from gamma and vega hedging. And we showed that indeed there were benefits in using reinforcement learning for gamma and vega hedging. And and we also looked at a number of, are you advancing the slides for me, by the way, or am I advancing the slides?
I was advancing them.
Can I advance them? Because I may go backwards
and
and forwards.
good. You have the button too. Great.
Yeah, okay. Because I may go, my button doesn't seem to work. Okay. Whoops.
Let me know if you need help.
Okay. I think we're still on the previous slide. Sorry about that. Okay, I'll tell you when we're ready to advance. But yeah, so this is the third paper that we've written in this area. The as I say, one of the attractive features of reinforcement learning is that you can choose your own objective function when you're hedging. And that's what we experimented with a bit in the second paper, the gamma and vega paper. And so the current paper is mostly focused on, whether you can improve things as far as exotic options are concerned. One point I'd make is that, we've got lots of authors for each of the papers. I am academic director of this research group called FinHub at University of Toronto. It's a mixture of engineers and finance academics from the business school. But the interesting thing about this current paper, and indeed, the other papers to some extent, is the mixture of academics and practitioners. The two of the 6 authors of the current paper are academics. That's myself and Zisis Poulos. But the other 3 co-authors are people who work for banks and pension plans, and they've got full-time jobs. One thing that happens is that all my meetings, either in person or online, all my meetings are sort of 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the evening, because many of the other authors of the paper have got day jobs. Okay, so let's see if I can advance this slide. Still not working. Can you advance it for me? Sorry. Okay, so just to set the scene, the traditional hedging approach is, of course, concerned with these Greek letters, delta, gamma, vega, and so on, and you can keep taking partial derivatives and get as many of these Greek letters as you like. And what happens with the Greek letters, of course, is that periodically, typically every day, you're setting up an instantaneous hedge. Let's focus on delta because it's easiest. What you're saying each day is that I want to set up a hedge such that if the price of the underlying asset moves a little bit, I won't lose money or gain money. My value of my position will stay much the same. So you're looking at a very small change. And what you're saying is that increases in value of your position are just as bad as decreases. What you want is the value of your position to stay exactly the same. So, there are actually this is where the 2 potential advantages of reinforcement learning come in. One is that we don't have to have this simple mean variance objective function. We can have an objective function which penalizes losses, or in fact, we can have any objective function we like with reinforcement learning. So it's got that advantage. And also, it looks ahead we'll see an example of this later, but it looks ahead in such a way as to reduce transaction costs. What you want to try and avoid doing, if you want to reduce transaction costs, is sort of, taking a position in the underlying asset today and then having to offload that position tomorrow. That's just a waste of transaction costs. And to some extent, you don't do that when you use reinforcement learning. Okay, can we move on? Okay, so what the reinforcement learning alternative is, develops a longer-term hedging strategy to be used in conjunction with periodic trading. So you've got the freedom to choose the objective function, which I think is a big plus, lower transaction costs, and there'll be one or two other advantages which I come up with later, but the other potential advantage is, traders' performance is assessed periodically, maybe every month, maybe every 3 months. And what you can do with the reinforcement learning alternative is to have a time horizon to say, I want to maximize how good my performance looks at the end of the month or at the end of the 3 months. Okay, let's move to the next one. So the reinforcement learning approach, as I say, reinforcement learning is a machine learning tool which is designed for situations where you're taking a sequence of decisions in a changing environment. So you take a decision today, the environment changes, you revise your decision tomorrow, the environment changes, you revise your decision the next day, and so on. It just seems perfect for hedging because that's exactly what you do in hedging. Okay, I mean, it's also got lots of applications in the management of portfolios, because to some extent when you're taking positions and revising the positions that you take and that sort of thing, again, it's a sequence of decisions that you're taking. So the aim is to come up with the best policy. In other words, you think what the states that you might encounter are, and you think, given all the states that might be encountered, what's the best strategy for going forward? So you start with a random policy, and then you just iterate. It's really a trial and error process. I'm not going to be talking in detail about the algorithm here, but we use what's called an actor-critic approach. But, basically just think about it as a trial and error approach. And you start with a totally random policy, which is probably not going to be no good at all. And then you think, which direction should I move this policy in to improve things? And you iterate towards the best policy. Okay, the states in the application that we're thinking about are the states of the underlying asset price, the remaining time to maturity of the derivative or portfolio of derivatives that you're considering, and you've got a time to maturity in mind, and your current holding of the underlying asset if we're just focusing on hedging using the underlying asset. If you're interested in reading more about the reinforcement learning approach, the nitty-gritty details, as it were, they're in the second paper that we wrote. Okay, there's a long section in the second paper. That's the Gamma and Vega paper. Incidentally, all three papers are on my website and they're on SSRN. And there's code to go with them on GitHub. But the second paper, the Gamma and Vega paper, we have this long second section which describes how the reinforcement learning algorithm works. Some of my colleagues wanted to include something similar in the third paper, but I was against that because, you know, the problem is if you have one of these long technical sections right at the beginning of your paper, then people often don't get past it to what I think is the really interesting part, which is the applications. So what we do in the third paper is we just refer people back to the second paper in terms of the details of, you know, of how the algorithm works. Okay, so the next slide, this slide is talking about why we save transaction costs. And this is a, you know, very trivial little example in a way, but it does illustrate the sort of thing that goes on. I mean, let's suppose you have a portfolio and it's got a delta of 50. And then the next day its delta goes up to 70. And then you know that the following day, delta's either going to come back to 50 or up to 90. So here you are, the delta has just gone up to 70. What do? You know, and you can think, well, one strategy is to sort of keep your portfolio delta neutral. So you revise the position you have in the underlying asset to keep it delta neutral to reflect the latest delta value. Or you could say, well, it might come back down to 50 again. So maybe we should just do nothing. And if it comes down to 50, we'll be pleased we did nothing. If it goes up to 90, you know, then we would have had to increase delta to 90 anyway, sooner or later. So you can sort of work out the cost of those two strategies. You know, when you're in the middle there and delta has just gone up to 70, what's the cost of the do nothing? Well, in terms of transaction costs, what's the cost of the do nothing strategy? And what's the cost of keeping delta in line with, or keeping your hedging in line with the latest delta? And of course, the do nothing strategy involves about half as much trading on average. Now, this is a fairly extreme example, of course, but it illustrates the sort of thing that happens, and we found this over and over again in our tests, that typically in a typical realistic situation, you save about 25% of transaction costs if you hedge using reinforcement learning versus you know, hedge using the Greek letters. Okay, the next slide perhaps. So, you know, what we did in this paper was to test whether reinforcement learning improves hedging for barrier options. And we wanted to get away from, we felt the first two papers sort of fully explore the transaction cost issue. So we wanted to get away from the transaction cost issue and just say, maybe even if there are no transaction costs, reinforcement learning can do particularly well as far as some exotic options are concerned. And barrier options seem to be a good choice, because I think the next slide will have a look at the next slide. Thank you. So you can see what the delta of a barrier option looks like. This is a down and input. The barrier's 10, and the strike price is 11. The volatility is 30%, and maturity is 10 days. So, you know, one of the features of a barrier option is that delta is discontinuous. And you can see that, you know, around $10, the $10 asset price, delta is indeed discontinuous in this example. And that's where the barrier is, of course. If you hit the barrier, then delta jumps from about minus 1.4 to minus 1, whereas if you don't hit the barrier, it stays at about minus 1.4. So delta, you know, is not great, you know, to sort of blindly use delta as your criteria for hedging doesn't work well for barrier options, and traders have come up with all sorts of different ways of, you know, of handling that, because after all, you're not hedging continuously, you're hedging once a day or something like that. And so you have to think what might happen over the next day. Will we cross the barrier? Won't we cross the barrier? And it's obviously, it is inappropriate to, have a delta as low as, in this example, minus 1.4. So this was the option that we chose to look at as, as our main example in the paper. Okay, let's continue. So we compare 3 strategies for a short down and input. Okay, so this is an option pretty similar to the one we've just looked at. So the first strategy is delta hedging. Each day the trader takes a position in the underlying asset to neutralize the delta of the option. Okay, right up to the barrier. Myopic hedging. Each day the trader looks 1 day ahead and chooses the strategy that's optimal for the objective function being assumed. So you basically you always have a 1 day time horizon between. You say, I'm not going to be doing anything to this hedge position between today and the next day, and you say, well, I want to optimize what happens between now and the next time I'm going to be adjusting the hedge. And we call that myopic hedging. And then there's reinforcement learning hedging, where the trader uses RL, reinforcement learning, to choose a strategy involving daily rebalancing that's optimal for the objective function over the life of the option. Okay, so let's see how those 3 strategies work out. We looked at 2 objective functions. Value at risk 95. I know for the audience here, I don't have to explain what these are. Value at risk 95 is the 95th percentile of the loss distribution, and CVAR 95 is the expected loss when the loss is larger than the 95th percentile of the loss distribution. So we're either looking at a particular point in the tail of the distribution, and we're trying to minimize that, saying we don't want the 95th percentile to be, we want the 95th percentile of the loss distribution to be as small as possible, or we're saying we want the average beyond the 95th percentile to be as small as possible, which is the CVAR, which you can't do with delta. I mean, delta is, as I say, one of these is a strategy where gains and losses are considered to be equally bad. Here we're, not penalizing the trader for gains, but we are penalizing for big losses. Okay, we have the next. So here are some illustrative results. This was for the asset price is 10.6, the barrier is 10. No. Sorry, yeah, it's okay. No, you went on one rather than. Can we go back to? Thank you. Should have got my laptop working better. The asset price is 10.6, the barrier is 10, the maturity is 20 days in this case, the volatile is 30%, and the option is on 100 units of the asset with daily rebalancing. So what do we see here? What we're seeing is what the objective function looks like for the different strategies. And, if we take, for example, and we're looking at a number of different strike prices for this option. So let's take a middling strike price. First of all, 10.6. What we see is that reinforcement learning gives a lower value at risk than the other 2 strategies and a lower conditional value at risk than the other 2 strategies. It's, in other words, this business of giving the derivative a particular objective function seems to work. It does give better values for that objective function than other methods which don't, like delta and myopic, which aren't looking at the value of an objective function over the whole life of the derivative. And the same is true for the other strike prices that we consider. Reinforcement learning outperforms delta and myopic for all the strike prices, for both value at risk 95 and CVAR 95. And of course, the payoffs are higher as the strike price goes up because we're talking about a put option. And, so we see that the potential gain from using reinforcement learning is higher when the strike price is higher. So it's, so it works. That's really what, it would be surprising in a way if it didn't work, because we're giving reinforcement learning the objective, the objective function is clear cut for reinforcement learning. It's nothing like as clear cut for the delta and myopic strategies. Okay, shall we move to the next? So we investigated what does reinforcement learning do that actually gives it the advantage over the other strategies. And what we found was that near the barrier, it underhedges relative to delta because it recognizes that there's some chance that the barrier will be breached and that the delta will jump up, because you remember from that earlier chart, delta jumps up if we breach the barrier. And so, within one day, there's a finite probability that the delta will jump up, and it's taking all of that into account. As you move away from the barrier, slightly overhedges relative to delta when you're quite a distance away from the barrier, because the cost of slightly overhedging is small compared with potential future benefits, we found out. Okay, next slide. So this is a robustness test. So, what reinforcement learning requires, at least as we've implemented it so far, and I'll have more to say about this in a minute, but as we've implemented reinforcement learning so far, it requires you to, at a particular time, develop a strategy for the next month, the next 2 months, whatever it is, or for the life of an exotic option if you're focusing on one particular exotic option, but it could be that you're focusing on, a big portfolio. But the point is that you set up this strategy at the beginning and don't change it. So you've got to make some assumption about things like volatility. And what we test here is, let's suppose you assume volatility is 30%. When in actual fact, volatility turns out to be something different over the life of the derivative, which in this case, we're assuming to be 20 days. So you can see, of course, if the volatility actually proves to be 30%, then, just as in the previous table, reinforcement learning outperforms delta and myopic. Not surprising, you assumed volatility was going to be 30%. Volatility actually turns out to be 30%, and you do better with reinforcement learning than you do with the delta and myopic strategies, which is what you would expect to happen. I should mention that what we assume in this table is that the delta and myopic strategies are able to keep track of the volatility as time passes. So they don't assume a volatility of 30% throughout. Okay, they watch what's happening to the volatility and adjust their strategies accordingly. So, what happens if the volatility is 20%? So you've built up a strategy assuming the volatility will be 30%. It actually turns out to be 20%. Well, it turns out that both VAR and CVAR still outperform delta and myopic. And, in the sense that it gives lower values for VAR and CVAR. And the same is true for 40%. So that's sort of showing that, this procedure is somewhat robust with respect to the estimates that you might make in setting up the strategy. If the volatility goes down to 10%, then we don't do so well as far as value at risk is concerned. But CVAR, actually, we're still ahead of the game. We're still doing better than Delta and Myopic on CVAR. So CVAR seems to be a little bit more robust than value at risk as far as that's concerned. And we see the same phenomenon if the volatility goes up to 50%. So what I'm trying to demonstrate with this table is that the reinforcement learning strategy is reasonably robust in that you can set up the strategy with certain assumptions about things like volatility, and if those assumptions prove to be wrong, you'll still be okay, and you still outperform simpler strategies. Okay, shall we move on to the next slide? No, thank you. We didn't assume any transaction costs in this, but we did keep track of the amount of trading that the trader is doing, which is kind of similar to looking at transaction costs. So you can see that, reinforcement learning requires quite a lot less trading than Delta and Myopic. Maybe 25–30% less trading than Delta and Myopic, which is, sort of on a par with what we found in previous work. Yeah, next slide. Thanks. So I mentioned earlier that we have 4 practitioners and 2 academics in the team that's been working on this. And one of the things about having practitioners on your team is that they're quite definite about the stress testing scenarios that they want to try out. So these are the ones we tend to use within our bank or within our pension plan. So why don't we see how well it works for them? So apparently 2 stress testing scenarios, which are popular, are called the L-shape and the V-shape scenarios. And the L-shape scenarios, well, you can see from the arrows, the dates over which the L-shaped scenarios apply. So you're sort of saying, let's suppose that in the future, we see something similar to what we've called the L-shaped scenario there. And with the V-shaped scenario, we're saying, let's suppose we see something similar to what we've called the V-shaped scenario there. How well will we do with the different hedging strategies? Okay, let's look at the next slide and see. So there's lots in the paper on this. We find that reinforcement learning outperforms both Myopic and Delta. Yes, you're going to make losses if you have these horrible looking scenarios, but losses were about 20% less than Delta and Myopic for both the L-shape and the V-shape scenarios. So in other words, at least for the tests that we carried out, and this was, obviously tests on real data, the tests that we carried out, it seems as though the reinforcement learning strategies cope with these stressed situations rather better than Delta and Myopic. And interestingly, CVAR outperforms VAR. And this has been generally our experience. If you're just going to use one, one objective function, which focuses on losses, it seems as though CVAR is preferable to VAR. Just sort of generally seems to have better properties all around. Okay, keep trying to advance slides. Next slide. Okay, the other thing we've looked at in this paper, and is the use of vanilla options to hedge barrier options. And we compared the use of reinforcement learning to determine the position in the vanilla options and the use of, just using vanilla options in the usual way to neutralize gamma. It's quite common to use vanilla options for things like barrier options. And we found that reinforcement learning does give better results in terms of the positions you're taking in the vanilla options. In other words, this look ahead strategy that underlies reinforcement learning works well in this particular case. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we've written three papers in this area. There is a fourth paper that's underway, and I promise you this will be the last paper. I'm getting, really need to move on to something else, but this, there is a fourth paper that's an extension of what I've been talking about that's underway. And this fourth paper is the idea behind the fourth paper is to make the strategy, the reinforcement learning strategy, dynamic. Because there's a couple of reasons why, in order to really sell the strategy to practitioners, we need it to be dynamic. One, it's all very well saying you set up this, reinforcement learning strategy and you don't touch it for the next month and it's going to work well. But in fact, of course, traders don't work like that. And if they get some new information on market variables, such as volatility, they would like to include that new information in the strategy. In other words, they'd like to adjust the strategy as time goes by to reflect new information. And of course, there's new trades coming in all the time as well. So they have to augment the portfolio that they're hedging to reflect new trades that come along. So what we've been doing is looking at ways to make the strategy dynamic so that we keep the benefits of the strategy, but improve on them by, by fine-tuning, if you like, the strategy as you go along. And what we do is we run the model each day to test whether the optimal strategy has changed. And then you have the initial optimal strategy, and then each day you find a new optimal strategy which reflects the new information in the market and the new portfolio you're trying to hedge. You might think this would be very time-consuming to rerun this reinforcement learning model every day. But actually, it's not as bad as that, because your starting point each day when you run the reinforcement learning model, your starting point is not a random starting point. It's the starting point is where you came from yesterday. And so, and that's going to be close to optimal. So we find that it actually takes a lot less time to, shall we say, refine your strategy than it does to develop your strategy from scratch. So this is how we see, this particular tool being used in practice. But this is work in progress. This will be our fourth and last paper, I think, in this particular area. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the conclusions. What are the advantages of reinforcement learning for hedging? That lower transaction costs, of course, freedom to choose the objective function. And, I've looked at VAR and CVAR. We have some friends in the statistics department at U of T who are looking at more complicated objective functions where, yes, you're penalizing results that are in the tail, the loss, the left tail of the distribution where all the losses occur, but you're also providing a positive to the objective function. if you end up in the other tail. So, and of course you can do that. So you can say, well, you know, I want, not only do I want to eliminate losses, but I'd also like to encourage gains. And you can set up, you know, you have total freedom in reinforcement learning to choose any objective function you want for hedging. Whereas, as I said earlier, the problem with the Greek letters is that the Greek letters sort of implicitly assume that gains and losses are equally bad. It does give better results for some exotics. We've only actually so far looked at the barrier options, but it does give better results for barrier options than traditional approaches when there are no transaction costs. You can choose the time horizon to match the way the trader's performance is assessed, as I said earlier, and the tests we've done in this paper indicate that this RL hedging is fairly robust and gives good results during stressed periods. So what's the disadvantage? The disadvantage, of course, is that it is computationally more demanding than traditional approaches. What we find on the, if you read the latest paper, the the exotic options paper, the latest paper, we do talk a bit about the computer resources that we use to develop the hedging strategy. And basically it takes us about an hour. Starting from scratch, it takes us about an hour to come up with a quote optimal hedging strategy. But we've been told by practitioners that, you know, our computers are pretty slow and, you know, basically they'd be talking about 4 to 5 minutes. So, and that's to come up with the hedging strategy from scratch. You know, just starting off with a random strategy and slowly improving it. So that's you know that's pretty encouraging. It's nice that, you know, computer speeds have finally caught up with this idea that we've had. But of course, you know, it will always be the case that just calculating delta and putting a trade in the underlying asset to reflect delta, I mean, that's always going to be faster than what we're doing. But what we're doing is sort of catching up with the traditional approaches. So that's really all I wanted to say. I was told to speak for 45 minutes. I guess I've just about done that. I'd be pleased to take any questions.
Well, first, thank you so much, John. Fantastic and sort of a new way of thinking about hedging and maybe eventually pricing of options. I have one question. How are the results affected by your choice of the objective function? In other words, are they robust if someone tries to pick something other than VAR, for example, or C-bar, in terms of lower transaction costs especially? Have you tried it? And do you have an intuition?
Well, that's a good question. So the question is, you know, if you choose some other objective function, will the transaction costs still be lower? I can't say that we've tested that. As I mentioned, we have some colleagues in the statistics department that we talk to from time to time at U of T, and they've used a more complicated objective function than us that sort of focuses on both gains as well as losses. And my recollection is that they said that they were saving transaction costs, but I'm not 100%, you know, just a vague recollection. Yeah.
I see. So is it your intuition that this reinforcement learning works best for sort of path-dependent sort of options? Is that sort of where it sort of contributes the most because you're looking at barrier options, or is it something that can be applied to hedging interest rate derivatives or others?
Well, my guess would be that it's sort of it has all the advantages that it had with barrier options. It has all the advantages that it has with vanilla options. You know, choosing your objective function, saving transaction costs and so on. And the additional advantage that delta and gamma and vega just don't work that well for barrier options because of the discontinuities. So that was why we chose barrier options. Of course, I mean, not all exotic options have got those discontinuities. So, you know, I wouldn't like to make the claim that, you know, it's going to work well for all exotic options. I mean, some exotic options, you mentioned path-dependent options. I mean, Asian options, for example, which depend on the average. I mean, they're relatively easy to hedge because you see more and more of the average as time goes by. So I don't think we'll get quite as big bang for our buck for Asian options if we tried it out. So we started with, you know, with options which we thought this procedure would work well for, I have to admit.
All right. Let's see. I think maybe they have a question. So there's a question from Steve. Does the runtime for computing the algorithm scale up linearly with the number of options in the book? So the speed and the number of options, is it a linear sort of a scaling up, or is it non-linear?
It's linear. It's linear, yeah. And we haven't, I mean, that's a good question. That 1 hour was really just for, you know, the single exotic option in the book. So, I mean, it's a very good question. You know, if you had 100 options in your book, it probably would be more than an hour using our computers, and a lot less than an hour using your computers. Yeah, no, that's a good question. We haven't really tested that out.
All right, very good. Well, oh, there's a question from Bing Liang. Okay, Bing.
I have a question about the objective function. It seems the easier extension is to use the Cornish-Fisher bar to incorporate higher moments like skewness and kurtosis. So have you tried that?
We haven't, no. And you say just use the higher moments, third moment, fourth moment, and so on. Is that what?
For incorporating into the bar, yeah, and SEMA.
Yeah. But if you just look at the moments, you've still got a kind of a symmetrical objective function, haven't you? Where gains and losses are considered symmetrically.
I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I guess you know, you take skewness into account, that kind of. Yeah, I mean, we could do that. We could do that fairly easily. As I say, what we really wanted to make the point that what really concerns the trader is losses. You know, and that's and you know, we want an objective function that focuses on losses. But no, you're making a good point. We could try that.
Yeah, I have a second question. It seems the advantage of the reinforcement learning works with a certain volatility range. You know, you showed us volatility from 2% to 50%. But it seems the advantage is diminishing, you know, if it's below 10% or over 50%. Is that right? Yeah, no, if there's the way for the basic methodology which I presented, if there's a really huge, I mean, you know, my results were, you know, except for the stress testing results, were based on geometric Brownian motion. And you make an assumption about volatility. Yeah, if there's a huge change, you know, 50% to way below 10%, from 30% to way below 10% or way above 50%, then yeah, obviously, you know, you can become unstuck as far as that's concerned. Which, you know, if there's a really big event that happens in the market that causes volatility to change dramatically, that's why I think this fourth, you know, a more dynamic model is going to sell better in the market than the models that we've looked at so far. I mean, it's kind of nice that the models we've looked at so far work well, and
that you know, they're reasonably robust.
All right.
But I think, you know, going forward, traders will be looking for a more dynamic version of the model.
Well, thank you very much, John, again, for taking time and presenting your new research to us. Appreciate it very much. We're going to take about the 25 minutes or so break until Doug Braden joins us. So I'm going to stop it. And
Right.
yeah.
Could I ask a question, Hussein? I typed in the chat.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
That's okay. So, John, there are some strange results in option pricing, especially when you consider stochastic volatility and jumps. And if you look at very short maturity options and very short horizons, you get some crazy amounts of returns, expected returns. So if you're writing, let's say, 1-day option, 2-day options on the index, then you know, there's good amount of money to be made there. And they don't even fit some of the models. Like if you look at the Duffy, Pound, Singleton, SVJJ model and all of those, in fact, there is a controversy in the field, is this kind of arbitrage money, you know, so much money to be made. But then there are papers that say, no, this does fit, kind of fits the models or whatever. So if you apply reinforcement learning to some of these, you know, crazy amounts of returns that are available by writing options, do you think that any research has been done on that, or, you know, that could be very powerful, more than modeling it using financial models?
Possibly. I mean, obviously, if the option only lasts for 1 or 2 days, then you've got to be thinking about a whole strategy for not only this option, but the subsequent options that you may buy or sell. But, you know, let me make a more general point that, you know, I understand that about 40% of the market for traded options right now is for 0-day options, right? And, you know, I think, you know, this is a sort of, kind enough to mention my book at the beginning. There is nothing about 0-day options in my book because they're a relatively new phenomenon. But I think there's a huge amount of research that can be done on 0-day options and, you know, 1-day and 2-day options, I think. And I think to sort of apply, you know, Black-Scholes-Merton to those options is probably not appropriate. And one needs a sort of new methodology, a new way of thinking about the options. So that is certainly something that, you know, I'm talking to my team about. We may get around to doing something on it eventually, but other people may as well.
Great. Okay. So thank you so much for the amazing talk, and we will meet at noon with Doug Braden. Thank you, John.
Well,
Very
yes.
good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.